Right, so we're here today to talk about academic freedom under threat all around the world, as you can see by the important set of partners that we have today for this event: the Africa Coalition for Academic Freedom, the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas, the Council of Europe, the European Students' Union, and the Southeast Asia Coalition for Academic Freedom. And really, with this, we are very much underlining the fact that restricting academic freedom undermines the right to education and the right to research and the right to teach. Before we get started formally, we have a bit of housekeeping to do. Okay, so we have a packed agenda for you today. We have a first introduction and welcome from Noah Sobey from UNESCO, followed by a roundtable on the erosion of academic freedom. And in the second roundtable, making sure that we're also platforming and learning from marginalized expertise on this topic, whether that marginalized expertise is from the Global South and also from students and learners. And then at the very end, we'll be launching the NORRAG Academic Freedom Fellows in Europe initiative. A quick word on NORRAG for those of you who don't know us. We undertake these 4 strategic activities on the inner donut there. So first and most importantly, underpinning everything that we do is surfacing underrepresented and marginalized knowledge. We also broker policy dialogue, co-produce knowledge, and share capacity. And we do those things in order for our stakeholders to be able to access knowledge that they need to actually know and understand that in order to be able to take action on that basis, and also amplify the knowledge and the experts that they have found through us. We work to 4 strategic themes: and data and evidence, how education intersects with the other SDGs, innovations and disruptions, and asking the question if private sector approaches can uphold access, equity, and quality, as well as making sure we're working with our network and deepening our partnerships. And this event falls squarely into the innovations and disruptions theme that we work on, disruptions to academic freedom, but also what is it that we can do in terms of research, policy, and practice to disrupt the threats to academic freedom that we are seeing and experiencing in some cases. We have a network of 6,000 members. If you're not already a member, where have you been? Please do join us. 50% of our members are based in the Global South, and we work across academia, civil society, and governments, international organizations, and the private sector. You're very welcome to join us, and we look forward to seeing you in our network chats as well. So here, thinking about this particular event, framing it as academic freedom under threat, we know we've seen headlines, we've seen clickbait, we've seen all of these, the noise around academic freedom and the threats to it. And we're here to really think seriously about that. This isn't about a sensationalist argument. It's not about pulling things out of headlines that we can just, sort of have a discussion in the same way as we would if we were among friends or in a bar. The serious examination here is, what is academic freedom? How is it being eroded? And is it being eroded in different ways in different places? Why does it matter? And also what needs to be done to reinforce it from within and also from outside. So really taking academic freedom as a portal that opens up into a series of other issues that are absolutely critical. Those issues being, yes, learning, teaching, and research, but also very much around democracy, participation, sustainability, the way that it is that we can think about issues now in order to have solutions in the future. So we're drawing on the definition of academic freedom that the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education's report from last June highlights, that it is not, we're not here to politicize, and we're absolutely here to roll back the politicization of academic freedom, because really academic freedom, yes, it is the right to think, to learn, to teach and to research, but it's also about how can we actually think about academic freedom as a function of the functioning of society. So these are some of the reasons why we think academic freedom matters. There are many more as well, of course, but here these are the ones that we really wanted to highlight in terms of its relevance to quality education, its importance to scholars and students. It's also about students being able to learn as well as to research and teach, and also its importance to society and to policy and practice. And on this note, I'm very happy to bring Noah into the conversation to talk a bit about how it is that UNESCO is thinking about this right now. Noah, over to you.
Thanks so much, Moira. Good morning, afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many people in the room and see where you're all from. So colleagues, let me begin by saying that clearly without academic freedom and institutional autonomy, higher education cannot play the role we need it to play, whether that's building knowledge, generating innovation, creating opportunity, strengthening democratic participation, and generally supporting people and societies to build flourishing futures. I think we need to think of academic freedom on several lines. For students, academic freedom includes the right to learn free from censorship and to be able to choose among rich and relevant learning pathways and curricular options. Options that, of course, should uphold standards of open-ended scientific inquiry and relate to contemporary political and social issues in critical and constructive ways. For faculty, academic freedom includes the right to teach and research without undue restrictions. University faculty need to be able to pursue research agendas that challenge conventional wisdom, and they should be free to share their ideas and expertise, including with the public, without fear of retribution. As UNESCO's 1997 recommendation on the status of higher education teaching personnel specifies, academic freedom also encompasses the right of researchers to join professional associations, to collaborate across borders without political interference. And some of you may have heard me say this before in other events, the open global collaboration that led to the development of COVID-19 vaccines in record-breaking time is an object lesson for us all in this regard on the importance of international scientific collaboration. Of course, the exercise of academic freedom also requires a high degree of institutional autonomy and collective responsibility. To engage in critical and innovative teaching, to undertake research that expands and transforms knowledge in the service of society and sustainable development globally, strong academic self-governance is necessary. I think it's crucial to have the broad participation of leadership, faculty, staff, and students in collegial decision-making related to academic standards and the management of academic programs and institutions. When we think about academic freedom from the vantage point of UNESCO, we're of course talking about a commitment on the part of the higher education team that I lead. We also, of course, work closely with our teachers team and our Right to Education group. And we also plug into work that's being done across the House to protect freedom of expression generally, something that's a key UNESCO commitment from the very beginning. So this manifests in our work to protect journalists, to safeguard artistic freedom, and also in our work to protect the rights of scientists. Of course, academic freedom and institutional autonomy are optimized within effective, appropriate systems of quality assurance, of public accountability, of global standard setting, and also local regulatory oversight. And it's only when all of these mechanisms are together geared on safeguarding the freedom to learn, the freedom to teach, the freedom to research, the freedom to cooperate internationally, that higher education can sustain public trust and operate in the ways that are necessary for it to be a well-functioning global common good. So I'll maybe stop with that. I'm as excited as the rest of you are to hear from our amazing experts and looking forward to following the panels and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noah. It's so important to be able to put this into that context. So for our first panel today, we have half an hour for the two panels that we are very glad to have with us today. The first panel, we have Delal Aydin, and we also have Marianne Persoons, Iveta Silova, and Oakley Welpley. So if you could all put your cameras on now, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Great, welcome. So we're going to start with Iveta. So Iveta, what does history teach us about the dangers of universities internalizing political pressure, and why should we be concerned today?
Thank you, Moira, and thank you, colleagues, for gathering us for this important discussion. My very simple answer to this question is that we should be very deeply concerned, because history shows us that academic freedom is rarely taken by force. More often than not, it is giving away voluntary, quietly, and under the illusion of pragmatism or neutrality, something that I have seen firsthand in the United States in the last couple of months. In the conversation essays that I wrote recently, and I will share the link a little bit later, I wrote about how U.S. universities are increasingly internalizing political pressure under threats from the Trump administration, ranging from federal investigations to funding freezes. Many institutions have begun dismantling their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, revising protest policies, and even placing departments under administrative oversight, as they have done at Columbia University. And these are not isolated decisions. They represent a broader institutional shift towards preemptive self-censorship. In my own university, faculty members are already advised by senior administration not to be a target, for example. So you see that self-censorship kicking in very, very quickly. And history gives us some clear warnings. In Nazi Germany, it wasn't brute force alone that reshaped higher education. It was academics and administrators who chose to align with the regime. In Stalinist Russia, entire disciplines were overhauled to reflect official ideology. And in fascist Italy, as you all probably may have read, the historical accounts more recently, over 1,200 professors were asked to swear an oath to the regime, and only 12 refused. In all of these cases, academic freedom was surrendered in an exchange for a perceived safety, not even a real safety, perceived. That's what makes the current moment in the United States and beyond so troubling. Because when universities start regulating not just what can be said, but what can be taught, researched, or funded, they stop being spaces for critical inquiry, and they become instruments of political control. But I also want to say not all of institutions are complying right now in the United States. We are starting to see some mobilization and resistance. Harvard, for instance, has recently begun pushing back, as have organizations like American Association of University Professors, which are challenging these pressures through legal and public channels. There is still space to fight for academic freedom, but only if we recognize that compliance is not protection. It's actually the beginning of erosion. So yes, I think we should be concerned, because what history teaches us is that the greatest danger comes not just from authoritarian governments, but from academic institutions that choose to normalize silence and then they call it neutrality.
Thank you very much, Iveta. That's powerful, that compliance is not protection. Thank you. Delal, what is it that you see in terms of the US and also Turkey? What does that reveal about these global threats to academic freedom?
Hello everyone. Thank you very much. I'm a sociologist from Turkey, and until very recently, academic freedom was often treated as if it is only at risk in authoritarian settings. But the recent targeting of institutions like Harvard, Columbia, and others in the US shows that these threats are emerging globally and including long-established democracies. In Turkey, we have seen academic institutions can be dismantled through political control, like universities like Boğaziçi University and some others were appointed trustees by the state. And we also saw criminalization of academics for peace who stood against the destruction of Kurdish towns in 2015 and 16. But I observed that the strategies are similar, like the delegitimizing academics, restricting critical inquiry, and reshaping institutions to reflect nationalist or ideological agendas. So the difference is just the framing, I think. The justification was in Turkey, it was like national security, but in the context of the US, it is like framed like cultural war, political battle, things like that. But the outcome is the same, I think. The outcome is narrowing of intellectual space and silencing the larger opposition. So I think it is very important to move away from seeing academic freedom as the problem of global South. It is a shared struggle, and we need shared transnational forms of solidarity and resistance to confront these restrictions.
Thank you very much, Delal, for reminding us of that shared struggle and to keep our eye on the ball. Recognize the strategies, but really keep our eye on the ball there. So, Oakley, what would you say are the less visible barriers to academic freedom?
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. Very interesting as well to listen to Iveta and Delal, and I think my answer would kind of cut across some of the aspects they've said. There are many less visible threats. For the purpose of time, I'll only list a few which draw on my own experience working in the UK context, where perhaps the restriction of academic freedom appears in less dramatic ways than it has most recently, but is equally as significant. And I think the two main points that I'd want to raise, one is what we can broadly call the kind of academic capitalism or neoliberal university, which tend to be overused terms, but do kind of point to the way in which certain types of erosion of academic freedoms are happening. And examples of this are, for example, through compliance and litigation in particular, and the role of complaints procedure, which has been very important in the UK recently. Another aspect that really strikes me in my own work as Deputy Executive Dean for People and Culture in particular is this new governance and management of risk and the emergence of risk assessments. So obviously we always had risk assessments for research. We want people to ensure their psychological, physical safety. But what I've noticed right now is the emergence of forms of risk assessment for events or lectures or research around sensitive issues. And this has become a form of regulation and surveillance as well, and very often leads to the cancellation of certain events. And this is really important if we think about that narrowing of the intellectual space and the limitations that this brings on debate, dialogue, and scientific inquiry. And then another point is really the assessment and evaluation of research and teaching, and the way in which these assessment frameworks can very significantly reduce and narrow the scope of research by defining what is valued, what constitutes valuable inquiry. And this is important both in kind of recognizing the diversity of research and plurality of voices and perspectives, but also these are decisions that have material manifestations manifestations in terms of the allocation of research, for example, what gets funded, what doesn't, but also as individual consequences on job security, on promotion, which leads to deciding who ends up in positions of leadership in university, for example, and who then contributes to making these decisions. And in the UK right now, we're seeing a number of compulsory redundancies going on in universities, which are often decided on the basis of what is valued in research. And then the final point I wanted to make was around the question of rights. And what we see emerging is rights which we think would uphold the idea of academic freedom actually being positioned against each other to undermine academic freedom. So one example in the UK, which I think reflects some of the issues in the US, is the opposition between the idea of freedom of speech and the idea of academic freedom. I can come back to that in future questions afterwards, but also the rights of different minority groups that are being played against each other, where one group is rights is seen as in opposition to the rights of another. And this kind of speaks to the relationship of university to society and the state as well, the lack of trust in universities, the idea of public opinion, but also the creation of imagined enemies. And I can speak to an example in France, which is where I'm from, of this threat of what they call Islamo-Gauchism, which has really plagued universities and led to a number of restrictions of academics' voices, being able to platform their ideas, but also to pursue their research safely.
Thank you for a comprehensive and extremely eye-opening list of both upstream and downstream and internal and external invisible factors. Thank you. Marianne, to come to the Council of Europe, you recently undertook a really interesting exercise conceptualizing and mapping obstacles to academic freedom. Could you just summarize that for us, please?
Yes, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. First of all, I would like to thank NORRAG for inviting the Council of Europe as this important international seminar. NORRAG asked us to be associated to the event, what we of course accepted with pleasure and honor. First of all, maybe not all colleagues know what the Council of Europe is. It is not to be confounded with the European Union. It's another European organization based in Strasbourg in France, and it comprises all European states on our continent. That's 46 of them. And the core mission of the Council of Europe is human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Important to mention is also that the Council of Europe is the home of the European Court of Human Rights. And the decisions of that court are one of the entries to understand how the Council of Europe sees academic freedom. They have treated recently, or in the last years, some cases of very clear violation of academic freedom of university staff in certain countries. And as such, these cases are interesting materials to sharpen the definition of academic freedom, and especially in contexts where university staff are also civil servants, a typical situation in some countries with state universities. And it gives us also an insight in the difference between academic freedom and professional integrity. We all know that professional integrity can easily be weaponized by public authorities, but also by the governance of universities to limit academic freedom. Now, the second entry is, in fact, what we do in the Steering Committee for Education, which I'm currently chairing. As we usually do, there is always a rotating system. Every 2 years, there is another country chairing, and for the time being, it's Belgium. The committee consists of representatives of the 46 member states, also observer countries, but also, and that's important, representatives of European organizations of education stakeholders. Indeed, we are convinced very firmly that education policies have to be established in co-creation with the educational field, not top-down from government to the schools. But it is important to state that the CDEDU is a member-led gremium, so it seizes the public authorities to take action to facilitate the education's role in creating a culture of democracy and respect for human rights, including for academic freedom. So for the time being, as Moira already said, we have a strand, academic freedom in action, which is part of our higher education program. The objective is, first of all, conceptualization, definition, and the definition is very often carried out in contrast with other concepts that are close to academic freedom, but have to be distinguished for methodological reasons. For instance, we make a difference between academic freedom as an individual right versus institutional autonomy. Both can be threatened simultaneously, but they have to be distinguished. One is really an individual right, the other is something else. We also distinguish academic freedom versus academic or professional integrity, what I already mentioned. Academic freedom is not 100% the same as freedom of speech, etc. So we see academic freedom not only as an individual right of the staff, but of the whole of all members of the academic community, including the students. This is, I think, something we want to stress very much. The second strand of the work is a description of the context in which academic freedom needs to be defended and which new challenges emerge, giving us the impression that there is an erosion of academic freedom that is very often in Europe a bit invisible, but nonetheless very much the case. We see among those threats or challenges economic imperatives. They become more and more important. They influence the funding, and in that turn also sometimes the choice for certain research subjects and preferences for certain outcomes to be published or communicated. There are societal changes related to social media, the influence of AI. There is, of course, also a geopolitical uncertainty where corporate or the stakes of the business world start to prevail over national governance. I think this is something we have to be very much aware of. And that leads to all kinds of new obstacles where individual scholars will be hampered, not at least by their own institution that wants to keep their financial sponsors happy or has become politicized itself. And the obstacles may be subtle and difficult to trace, but they express themselves by limited choices of research topics, also leading sometimes closing down of certain study programs, also self-censorship of researchers in publications, and communication with the wider public. I will keep it with this. Maybe in a later stage I can say a bit about our more concrete actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Right, so back to you, Dalal. You mentioned at the end of your last intervention that we shouldn't think of academic freedom as just a global South issue. Could you tell us a bit more about why that is a wrong way to think about this?
I am currently based in Switzerland, but I also spent time in Germany and Italy. So I had a chance to compare, different academic settings. And there, I often observed, as if academic freedom is an issue of distant, problems of distant countries, authoritarian regimes, and but I also experienced different approaches to academics at risk. I will start with the bad one, Germany. In Germany, I was supported institutionally, but often under the framework, like humanitarian framework. So I was, for example, invited to speak about Kurdish issue as a Kurdish scholar, but it was never as a sociologist, for example. I often felt that I was seen more like a Kurdish scholar who needs help rather than a sociologist colleague. And I think this reflects epistemic marginalization because where scholars like me from politically repressive contexts, we are accepted as cases rather than colleagues, and our presence is accepted as in the form of diversity more than, and this leads our expertise to be sidelined, not to be part of academic knowledge production in general. And this has consequences. It is not my only problem or personally scholars at risk, but all the academic community as a whole. And so I think I will agree with Marianne. It's not academic freedom is not only about protection from censorship, but it is about creating the conditions for knowledge production in general. And when the critical perspectives, disciplines, or scholars are excluded, then it weakens all the academic community, all the knowledge production in general. And it limits also the question as a human community, the questions we ask, the futures we imagine, it limits all of this. And then in contrast, in Switzerland and in Italy, I felt more included in the knowledge production as a sociologist too. And so my idea is that seeing academic freedom as the problem of global South is not only about helping, academics at risk, but also understanding the problem in a narrow way. The problem is larger. The problem is all about how can we imagine a future for our human community. And so it's very important to support it is not support symbolically, but also create spaces for participation, exchange, co-production of knowledge. So I think it requires an institutional transformation now. How do we understand, or how to create new spaces for larger academic freedom?
Thank you very much for that. And it's certainly one of the ways that we understand our purpose as NORRAG is absolutely being a space for that co-production of knowledge, particularly for marginalized expertise, as you can see on the banner that I have behind me. So Oakley, can academic freedom then be considered a universal value? Should it be?
Thank you. And thank you, Dalal, for a kind of a really interesting talk. And I fully agree with your points about not seeing academic freedom as only the global South, which kind of leads to this rather provocative question of can academic freedom be considered a universal value, and should it be? And I think if we take this question at its most fundamental level, then should academic freedom be for everyone, be universal for all? Then the answer is a resounding yes. And I think that's kind of the starting point. But the kind of flip side of that is that the question does get a bit more tricky if we look more closely at the notion of universal and its uses and abuses throughout history. And that's kind of the tension that interests me here. So if we look at academic freedom within the context of European history, the principle was conceived as a universal protection against despotism or absolute power in order to allow the freedom to think, to talk, to exchange ideas. Yet at the same time, this very notion of universality also occupied a central position in the modernist project of coloniality, where universality became understood as European Western values, viewed as superior and a justification for oppression, and the imposition of a single form of knowledge, which erases all other non-European forms of knowledge, what we could call epistemicide or epistemic domination. So here we have this tension with the idea, if we think of academic freedom as a universal value, which was born in the modern university, where it was really understood as the academic freedom of the few and mainly white male European academics, which was at the exclusion of many other groups and also civilizations and forms of knowledge. So I think in order to address this question, I would ask more questions about academic freedom, which is it universal for whom, in whose name? Who will uphold this freedom? Who will defend it, and against whom? How will we create communities that can protect it and that can help it flourish? But also what are the limits to this freedom, and where might these limits be necessary, and how can they be imposed? And for that, it's kind of looking back at history as well, but thinking at different areas of academic research, for example, eugenics, a racist pseudoscience, but also perhaps, I don't want to offend anybody who's a geographer, but geography, which was considered at a given point as a very colonial discipline, which went about mapping the world through a Western gaze and kind of deciding what the world would look like from a very narrow epistemic center. And today we have questions as well about the ethical aspects of various research, for example, the development of technology and artificial intelligence. But at the same time, there's a risk that if we start questioning the universal value of academic freedom, we end up with the dissolution of the notion itself through a kind of ultra-relativism or attributing academic freedom to a question that's only in certain world regions or the global South. So my view is that the multiple threats, and some that are really a matter of life and death to academic freedom, make it important and urgent to think about how to protect it across all regions of the world. So my proposition here would be to think about a critical universality of academic freedom, which is based on three principles. One, academic freedom understood as situated, ethical, and just. And for me, it's within this pursuit of justice along these three main principles that we can really think of academic freedom as universal.
Thank you, Oakley. Very important distinction there to be made. So now, Iveta, in light of these growing restrictions on academic freedom across all of these diverse contexts that we've been talking about, how might we rethink academic freedom, not just as an individual right?
Yes, so I wanted to challenge us to think about this a little bit further, and also further building on Oakley's ideas and Dalal's. So academic freedom is often framed, especially in the Western world, definitely in the United States, as a personal entitlement, a right that protects individual scholars from interference and censorship. And this framing reflects, as Oakley just was explaining, a very Western liberal idea of freedom, one that is actually rooted in detachment, in autonomy, and in self-protection. It assumes that freedom exists prior to a relationship and that others are mostly threats to that relationship. And while the protection of individual freedom is essential, especially in today's climate, it doesn't tell the whole story either. In reality, academic freedom doesn't live in isolation. depends on relationships between scholars and students, within departments and institutions, and with the broader communities that we serve. It's something that we practice and protect together, never really on our own. And it becomes fragile when those relationships are weakened, whether by political pressure, by institutional retreat, or by the cultures of fear that are now resurfacing so strongly in our institutions. In actually one of the articles, chapters that we wrote for NORRAG book that was recently published, that Maura co-edited, I wrote a chapter on learning development with my colleagues Jeremy Rapley and Hikaru Komatsu. We tried to challenge also this dominant Western idea that freedom means being detached or being disembodied from others, and kind of challenge us to think, what if we thought of freedom not as something that we hold alone, but as something that emerges from the relationships that we have, from reciprocity, from solidarity, from care for each other. And the shift is especially important in the current context in the United States, but also globally, where some faculty feel free to speak while others are silenced, as Delal so eloquently already discussed, not just by policy, but by precarity, by risk, by the absence of protection. So in the US today, some people, especially scholars of color, queer or trans faculty or immigrants or political activists who support Gaza face disproportionate risks compared to other faculty. And if academic freedom is only defended in the abstract, it can very quickly become a privilege that is available to a few rather than a shared commitment to inclusive and just knowledge and also knowledge production. So to defend academic freedom today, I think we need to think more relationally, not just about our own rights, individual rights, but about the conditions that allow all of us, especially those that are most vulnerable right now, to think, to question, and to imagine freely. And that means building communities of support, refusing isolation, and recognizing that freedom is not just a right to be claimed, but also a responsibility that we need to nurture and to defend collectively.
Thank you very much. And in keeping with our shared and collective struggle, last question for Marianne for 2 minutes on action. What is it that the Council of Europe member states will be doing in the near future?
Well, Moira, we'll take the liberty maybe to blend in a few reactions to what we just heard by the previous speakers. We have, of course, had 2 conferences, one on academic freedom in action, which is in fact has been a discussion to that will lead to a new publication coordinated by Professor Peter Maassen from the University of Oslo, which is a report on the threats of academic freedom. We also had very recently, 2 weeks ago, a global forum on higher education under the theme Renewal of Democratic and Civic Mission. And what was interesting is that it was co-organized by the Council of Europe in cooperation with the International Consortium for Higher Education, Civic Responsibility and Democracy, which is based in the US, in cooperation with the International Association of Universities and the Organization of American States. So it was, in fact, a kind of transatlantic dialogue. And there we had interesting new insights that will feed into the legislative work that we will do with the member states. We talked a lot about the geopolitical situation where the old world order or the older world order will never come back. I think this is extremely important. We should not dwell in the past. We have to look into the future and see what higher education can do. We spoke about political polarization, and we see academic freedom as part of the democratic and civic responsibility of academics and institutions. It's true that you can't see academic freedom in isolation, but every right comes with a responsibility towards the society. And this responsibility, this engagement in society, in democracy, there is a thin line, of course, between that kind of engagement and straightforwardly start to politicize a university. Because a politicized university is a vulnerable university. And we know this very well in Europe, with the experience of being haunted by two totalitarian systems. Totalitarian, which is more than just autocratic. These systems have haunted our continent in the 20th century, first fascism and later, to use the term of Hannah Arendt, state communism as brought about by the former Soviet Union. But we also reiterated, and there the member states can also come in, that we need democratic governance of higher education, democratic governance also in the way our institutions are organized, with statutory representation, structured democratic voice of students, staff, and other stakeholders. And that higher education is a strong facilitator that we have to facilitate this academic freedom also for students, but I said that before. So what will we do? We'll prepare a recommendation of the Committee of Ministers on academic freedom, on preserving or guaranteeing academic freedom, and where we will list what member states, what public authorities can do in order to create a climate or a framework where academic freedom can flourish. And we hope, of course, to have many inputs from the stakeholders which join the discussions in our committee. So
thank you so much. Thank you, Marianne. We will follow that with great interest. So collective responsibility is also to make sure the second roundtable has their time. So I'm going to ask all of you to turn your attention to the Q&A. I see, Iveta, you've already started answering some questions. You can type answers into those questions. So please, if the remainder of the panel could also put your attention over to the Q&A. And type those questions in. And I'm very happy to say thank you all very much for a very full and rich and wide-ranging discussion, and very deep too. And now handing over to Frank Geary, who is who works at Scholars at Risk in Europe, and he will be facilitating the next roundtable. Over to you, Frank.
Thank you very much, Moira, and thanks to NORRAG for hosting and organizing this really interesting and important event. So while my colleagues on this second round table open your cameras and get ready for some questions, I will briefly introduce the topic. What we're looking at here is we're looking at what can we learn from traditionally marginalized expertise in the Global South and from students and youth. And the context of this is that in the past 2 decades, we're seeing academic freedom in decline on all corners of the globe. The Academic Freedom Index in 2024 reported that over half of the world's population, 56.5%, now live in environments where academic freedom is either completely or severely restricted. In Scholars at Risk, our Free to Think report underlines further these challenges faced by scholars, students, and institutions. In the 2024 Free to Think report, it details 391 separate attacks across 51 countries, highlighting concerning trends across Africa, the Americas, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. So given the global nature of these attacks, an equally robust global response is needed.
And in recent years, we're seeing innovative and effective approaches in the form of regional coalitions for academic freedom that have emerged in Africa, the Americas, Southeast Asia, and also in work on academic freedom with and by students. So in this roundtable, we'll be hearing from some of the key actors in these coalitions and movements. I'll briefly introduce everybody and then we'll go straight into questions. Kwadwo Apogwe-Atua is the Regional Director of the Africa Coalition for Academic Freedom, and he's also a Professor of International Law at the School of Law in the University of Ghana. Bencharat Say-Chua is Director of the Southeast Asia Coalition for Academic Freedom and is a Lecturer of Human Rights and Peace Studies at Mahidol University in Thailand. Camila Croso is the Director of the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas, and she is a Brazilian human rights, education and democracy advocate and researcher with huge experience in this area. And Iris Kimizolu is President of the European Students' Union, and she has held student representative positions in local, state, national and international levels. So we are, as you can hear, we have a huge amount of expertise in this discussion. So I am going to begin just with the first question to you, Kwadwo, which is, should there be a relativist or regionalized approach to analyzing and providing critical perspectives on academic freedom?
Thanks, Frank, and happy to be here to take part in this interesting discussion. So far, it's been very enriching for me, and I think partly the question that is posed to me here has been answered one way or the other by some of the previous speakers, especially Adele, and I think Yvette as well. So the question is to analyze the point that, yes, there is a need for a relativist or regionalized approach to dealing with human rights in general, but in this particular context, academic freedom. That is not to say that there is no need to respect some universal values, but we need to question some of these universal values because of their Eurocentric origins that do not enable us to have a perspective that is comprehensive and that speaks to the experiences of different countries across the globe, particularly countries that have been subjected to colonialism. There's been a talk about epistemicide or epistemic violence against knowledge production and against the knowledge base in a number of non-European societies. And in the African context, we had a situation where ancient universities, pre-modern universities, which existed prior to the Bolognas and other universities in Europe, were subjected to a form of epistemic violence, which led to the eradication of these universities and jumping into the colonial period, where colonial universities were set up to pursue a particular colonial agenda for the European colonial authorities, which has created a sort of coloniality of higher education in the African society. Excuse me. So when we look at academic freedom issues, we need to look at it from two lenses: the universal lens, which needs to be moderated or incorporated into that, the unique experience of Africa with respect to academic freedom. And so in this context, the actors and the factors in the academic freedom equation would differ. And so we see that in the African context, attention should be paid to issues that relate more to economic, social, and cultural rights issues, in addition to issues that relate to civil and political rights. So when we're talking about academic freedom from the European perspective, which is more or less related to individual liberal ideas of rights, which centers around freedom of expression. In the African context, it encompasses that to include right to education, right to science, and so on. So it's not just about the fact that you need to liberate yourself or to be given the opportunity to pursue your own individual agenda, but also the need for governments and other actors to come in to provide certain resources before some communities can enjoy their rights and therefore their academic freedom. And because governments control these resources, they also tend to control the university. And some of these control instruments also come from outside the countries, from the former colonial authorities, through issues such as internationalization and so on. So these are issues that need to be factored in to recognize the need for relativizing the idea of the universality of academic freedom principles. And that is what has given birth to the Africa Coalition for Academic Freedom, which seeks to develop unique Africa principles on academic freedom for application within the African context.
Thank you, Kwadwo. And that's really interesting, the way that focus on the origins of these values impacts the practice that you are doing within the African Coalition for Academic Freedom. Thank you very much for that. Ben Charat, a question for you is, how is academic freedom understood in the Southeast Asian context? And what are the implications on work to protect academic freedom where it is a discourse that is not generally understood?
Thank you, Frank. I think if we talk about the understanding about academic freedom in Southeast Asian context, we need to look at the role of and the expectation from education in the Asian context in general. Why it might be the same that education is expected to produce good citizen for the state, but the definition of good citizen or civic education in the not only Southeast Asia but in Asia in general is very much different from what you may find in the context where critical thinking is celebrated, or where human rights and freedom are the common values that shared by the public at large, or in the context where it is encouraged to ask a difficult question. But in the context like Southeast Asia, education is one of the core mechanisms and tools of the state to produce submissive citizens that will blindly follow state ideology, citizens that will work towards what the state defines as national security, or the citizen that does not ask the question. And this could vary in different contexts. In Thailand, where I come from, it could be about the nation and the monarchy and Buddhism. In Indonesia, it is about the Pancasila principle, where the state ideology defines what a citizen should do, and also the military. In Vietnam, it is about the Communist Party, and civic education is about teaching about the Communist Party, but not about civil rights or active citizenship. In Myanmar, it is all about the military and Buddhism. So these are the contexts that we live in Southeast Asia, or again, as I said, it could be applied to Asia at large. But this has been challenged a lot recently, including by the youth movements that rise up in many countries, asking difficult questions, challenging school and university regulations, and demanding for human rights and democracy. And there are also education reform efforts in many places, although they are still very marginalized when we look at their place within the education policy. And another important element of factors when we talk about academic freedom in Southeast Asia, which might put us a little bit different from the discussion we had earlier in the previous panel and in the question that we received in the Q&A, is the fact that many of the academic in the region in Southeast Asia, they are also scholar activists. Many of them engage in activism, and therefore it is not only about freedom to speak or to teach or to do research, but it is also about freedom to speak out and work for social justice and democracy. And therefore, we cannot really talk about academic freedom without addressing human rights in the society in general. And I think in our discussion so far, and also in the question and Q&A, there's some concern about the issue of politicization of academic freedom. But I would say in Southeast Asia, we really need to politicize academic freedom because we cannot separate the two issues. Many academics are attacked not because of their discipline or what they research or teach, but because of their involvement in social justice struggle. Human rights and freedom of expression in general, therefore, have very close relationship to academic freedom. So what are the implications then if we talk about academic freedom in such a context? Another issue that we need to understand is education is seen as a privilege, and so is rights. Education and human rights or freedom are not like the common shared value within the society. But therefore, the work for academic freedom should really dismantle that perception and build a new form of social values that accept and promote freedom and human rights. And this is what we need to work together, not only like by individual academics or individual institutions alone, and not only in one country, but we really need collaboration to learn from each other and to promote this concept and idea together.
Thank you very much, Bencharat. And I think that's really interesting, the focus on how context shapes the approach. And your final point there about the importance of collaboration, absolutely why we're all here today, which is really interesting and great. Thank you for that. Camilla, I'm going to turn to you now. The question for you is, what are some of the key manifestations of attacks on academic freedom in your region? And what are some of the ways of resistance that is being organized?
Thank you so much for that, Frank, and thank you for all panelists who have spoken so far. It's been extremely enriching for me to be joining this panel. And thanks, NORRAG, for the invitation and for the initiative. Yes, I think I want to start by mentioning the profound undermining of higher education in particular, and of its fundamental mission as part of a much, let's say, macro attack to academic freedom. So if the entire education system, and in this moment in particular, attacks on the essence and the very mission of higher education, that is framing, let's say, everything else that orbitates around our struggle for academic freedom. And I think that for us to be defending this broader mission and mandate of education of universities is a call for action for all of us who are now engaging in the struggle for academic freedom and university autonomy. This also goes hand in hand with scientific denialism, with the diminishing of the teaching profession across the entire region, of stigmatization of student struggles, and of the teaching profession itself, really, of what it is that academics are doing and their work, and the devaluation of the work and of their contract. So something that I do want to underline here is the problematics of precarious contracts. I think many of the previous colleagues have already mentioned this, but when you have precarious contracts, it is really a form also of isolation, of fear, of loss of autonomy, really. And therefore, it really is one of the strategies that are playing out in the Americas in terms of influencing and diminishing the space of teachers to teach, research, disseminate their knowledge. And of course, as others have also mentioned, this does not impact only on individual, on those teachers whatsoever, but because academic freedom is a cornerstone of the right to education, that impacts completely on the right to students, of students to learn, and of society to benefit from the collective knowledge that flows from the education systems. So again, the loss of autonomy is a fundamental aspect in the Americas, and that includes pedagogical autonomy and all the subject matters that are being particularly targeted, such as race, gender, human rights as a whole, climate, the environment. It involves financial autonomy, so the fundamental definancing of education systems and of research systems across the Americas is a key dimension of attacks on academic freedom. Governance autonomy as well, so the interference of decision-making in terms of who is actually the rector of universities, and actually we also see this happening in basic education, as well as we see it happening in basic education when it comes to pedagogical and financial autonomy. There's huge amounts of censorship across the region, and particularly related to gender in the Americas. There's a wave of so-called, in many inverted commas, gender ideology, which of course there's no such thing as a gender ideology. There is struggles for gender justice, which has been reframed in this very pejorative language, and it affects both basic education and higher education. The gender violence is a dimension that I do want to mention. Not only is gender a problematics here in Latin America and across the Americas, Canada, and the United States as well, in terms of the subject matter, but also violence in regards to teachers, the teaching profession, to students, and how that fear absolutely impacts academic freedom of the professors and of the students as well. So it's a taboo issue. It's invisibilized as a topic across the region, at least, and something that we are taking to the Inter-American Commission and even to CEDAW. So in terms of modes of resistance, what I would underline again and again, and I know many have mentioned, Iveta including, is collective action, collective strategizing, overcoming fear and isolation, which is something that is a huge problem, and creating communities of solidarity and communities of support. That for me is the central dimension of what we are seeing, is not complying. Modes of resistance is really about collective action across any subject matter, actually. And then I would also mention, as a mode of resistance, the creation of protocols at institutional level, so that actually from protocols we can actually be challenging the cultures within the institutions, and there actually being mechanisms to talk about what is happening, to resist, to think, to strategize. So that again is something important. I'll stop here, just wary of time, and then we can circle back for later. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you very much, Camila. And that message about collective action to overcome fear and isolation is absolutely central to everything that we are doing here, I believe. I'm going to turn to you, Iris, to ask, from your perspective, what is the role of students as rights holders and protectors of academic freedom, considering also issues of diversity and inclusion that have been coming up in the discussion?
Yes, thank you. Hello. First of all, we need to start by seeing that students are right holders and also protectors, but we can also be perpetrators, actually. If you look in Nazi Germany, for example, students had a big role, actually, in being used to rat out teachers that were not in line with the regime and so on. And the same we see also nowadays in many countries. But at the same time, I believe that diversity has a point here, because the more diverse a student body is and the more different perspectives there are, there's also students that are not in line with whoever's in the majority of the government or whatever. So diversity is already something that enhances the chance to have academic freedom protected by students, but also within the staff body, actually, because you have less alignment within this body of people. But looking more into the, let's say, positive angle on students, we are the largest group of people that are persecuted, actually, worldwide, compared even to the numbers of researchers, of academics being persecuted. There's way more students being persecuted than scholars. So there is a potential of these people to be also mobilized to defend academic freedom. Very often we lack the language for it, and we lack even the knowledge how to determine that there are breaches unless they are really, really huge. So there's one thing to be politically persecuted and I'm in front of a judge and whatever, or the police is raiding my home. These are realities, for example, in Thailand. But the other thing is to detect it very early on in the stages where maybe it's more seen from a neoliberal point of view, where we are more talking about freedom of speech and less about the right to life in a sense. And if we are able to get students to realize what's going on, they can be a big force. We have seen this in Europe with Belarus in the last years. The students were on the forefront trying to defend a democratic Belarus. I mean, we were not able to succeed there, but for years and years, it was students upholding the protests. We see it in Serbia right now, where again, it is students that have been leading the protest movement for democracy. So it goes even further than only the education bubble. It goes into really protecting democracy. I know from Thailand, because I had contact in the past in Malaysia as well, that there's students and the youth movement that are really pushing forward the resistance. And the same goes for many other regions in the world. So students are quite essential. The problem is, if we don't do the job of educating them around this topic, and if we don't ensure that this diversity of students become multipliers of academic freedom, then we're losing out of this potential, basically, of them realizing that they have rights and that they want to fight for this right. And once they graduate as graduates and former scholars, to also fight as normal citizens, basically.
Thank you very much, Iris. That's really useful. And I think that your emphasis there on diversity as a force to strengthen academic freedom and students as a force to promote academic freedom is really useful for this discussion. Time, unfortunately, as always, is against us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to circle back to each member of the panel and ask you to do something very challenging, unfortunately, which is to just distill your thoughts to really kind of final key points. And I will ask you a question to stimulate that. So, Kwadwo, can you tell us what unique advocacy strategies stand out for you to tackle academic freedom violations in the Africa region?
Thank you, Frank. Yes, I think first of all, we need to understand that African nations and African Union and its Human Rights Commission have not been interested in producing a document on academic freedom. It has rather been academics through the Kampala Declaration on Intellectual Freedom and Social Responsibility of 1990, and then the Dar es Salaam Declaration, and then the Juba Declaration more recently, that have produced some documents on academic freedom. And so the bottom line is that African leadership has not shown the real interest in protecting and promoting academic freedom. Therefore, secondly, African leaders have been using universities as proxies to do their own bidding within the university space. We see a number of African countries recognizing for the first time academic freedom in their constitutions in the post-Berlin, fall of the Berlin Wall world, but they have not translated them into concrete actions. So it is important that academics and students form a united group. We also see tension between the two because academics have often violated the rights of students within the classroom space where there are asymmetrical power relations. But the two can join forces and help to protect their spaces against the university so that university autonomy can be respected, which can then grant a large level of academic freedom for the three components of stakeholders in the academic freedom space, which is the university in terms of institutional autonomy, academics for the academic freedom, and students for students' academic freedom. And this will be a strong force that can be used to protect the space of the university and to fight the hard stance taken by governments, and which can then reach out to external actors that also have been conniving with governments to violate academic freedom in the university space. So I think that is an important strategy that needs to be taken into account in dealing with academic freedom violations in Africa.
Thank you, Kwadwo. That's greatly appreciated. Bencharat, I'm going to turn to you. And again, unfortunately, we are running up against time. So I'm asking everyone to just kind of give us a 1 minute summary of really key points. From your perspective, what is the space that we could use to defend academic freedom in the context of authoritarian returns and neoliberalized education?
Thank you, Frank. Southeast Asia doesn't have principle on academic freedom, nor do we have the regional human rights mechanism. Therefore, the legal approach or the approach that Kwadwo mentioned is not the answer for us. For me, I really think we really need to work on the collective action that we have been talking about, and also on the raising the awareness of the academic themselves. Because what strikes me is that it is only in few places that the academic come out to speak about this issue or to defend academic freedom, probably because the stake is too high, or probably because it has become a norm to simply accept the university regulations, the demands, or the quality assurance system, and everything that the university system put on us. So it is very important to build movement, collective action, and not only to defend academic freedom, but rights and freedom in general.
Thank you, Bencharat. Yeah, and that idea of movement, I think, is definitely a theme right across what everybody has said. Camilla, I appreciate it's difficult to summarize this in a minute, but can you tell us how have the inter-American principles on academic freedom and institutional autonomy been important to advance the struggle for ensuring the right to academic freedom?
Sure, Frank. I mean, I know time is short, but I do want to underline that in the Americas, this has been a very important progress that we have managed to conquer, let's say. The Inter-American Principles for Academic Freedom and University Autonomy were approved in 2021. They serve as a legal basis, as a standard setting, let's say, to inspire and to use as a benchmark against which we can look at what is happening at national level with the national legislations, subnational legislations as well, and sort of like raise the bar and be a tool for us to promote the struggle. But I do want to say, Frank and colleagues, that in Latin America in particular, there is a tradition, a long-standing tradition. I want to refer to the reform of Cordoba from over a century ago, 1918 in Argentina, when really, and here kudos to the student movement who have been absolutely adamantly important in so many struggles, but including the struggle for academic freedom. They have, at that time in 1918 in Argentina, they raised their voice to request academic freedom, to request university autonomy and increase student participation in decision-making, and that influenced national legislation since back then. So I think that there is this tissue, let's say, of social movement in Latin America in particular, where academic freedom and where university autonomy has become much more, particularly university autonomy, has become much more, let's say, part of the conversation, less so academic freedom. It is necessary, in my view, therefore, to build in terms of this history of movement that we have. We still need to place academic freedom much more center stage in the agenda. And here there is an invitation to those colleagues here from UNESCO as well, and from the Council of Europe, who I know is on the board of the High-Level Steering Committee on SDG4, that this should be much more part of that conversation. Like the education community needs to be speaking much more about academic freedom as a fundamental human right and part of the right to education. And all of us together really speak about how academic freedom is a cornerstone of democracy, in as much as a free press and an independent judiciary and a strong civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla. Yeah, and that idea of building on the history is absolutely essential to what we're doing. So, Iris, the final words to you. What are current issues, both de jure and de facto, for students to exercise their right to academic freedom?
From a de jure perspective, we have the problem, especially here in Europe, if you look in the constitutions, very often you have only parts of academic freedom in the constitution. So you have very often the freedom to research, the freedom to science, the freedom to arts, something around this, and then sometimes also the freedom to teach. But if now as a student I go to the courts and I say my academic freedom was violated, to my freedom to learn, if this is not also in the constitution, the courts will always rule in favor of the freedom to teaching and the scientific freedom if there's a conflict with those two. So what we have as an issue de jure in Europe is that it's not academic freedom that is constitutionally protected, but only subparts of it, being teaching and science, but very rarely is the freedom to learning protected. So de jure, we would really need to have the freedom to learning also protected constitutionally, but then de jure only brings us so far if in the realities we are still being persecuted regardless of whether it is in the constitutions or not. And in practice, there is very often the sentiment that students don't have the same right to academic freedom than other academics, which doesn't make sense because we are the largest group of academics in academia. So there's also a bit of a cultural issue that even politicians, even rectors sometimes believe that students don't have equal rights to academic freedom.
Thank you, Iris. And that's, I think, a very concrete point for us to finish this very, very rich discussion. So thank you so much, Kwadwo, Ben-Charat, Camilla, Iris, for this really rich conversation. I would encourage you to go over to the Q&A and engage with people. Apologies to people that time, as always, was against us, so that we haven't had time for a spoken Q&A, but there's plenty of activity and action happening over in the Q&A area. So with that, I will wrap up, thanking you all and pass back to Moira. Thanks, Moira.
And thank you, Frank, for moderating that second roundtable and really very huge amounts of thanks to all of the panelists. And you'll see in the chat many participants very much saying, this is really important what you're saying. Thank you so much for doing it. If you are interested in hearing more from the regional coalitions that you've heard from here, sign up for a side event to the Human Rights Council. We've just put the link in the chat. It is available online as well as in person if you happen to be in Geneva. Right, so a quick scurry around NORRAG's Academic Freedom Initiative. The initiative itself comprises these 4 different aspects. And so we will be launching a survey later in this year, working with the AACU initiative that Iveta mentioned, as well as policy dialogues that we will be organizing, and also publications and disseminations toward the end of next year, beginning of 2027. And what we're launching now is the Academic Freedom Fellows in Europe initiative. And this obviously is a sister initiative to the other regional coalitions that you've heard from already today, who are doing such a fantastic job of documenting and defending academic freedom in their regions. And we are going to be launching this particular initiative for a set of 20 fellows in Europe. And those fellows will be given a small amount of resources in order to be able to do some research, in order to be able to come together to have these discussions, and in order to be able to develop the kind of conversations, initiatives, discussions, and really holding on to that shared struggle and that collaborative approach and that community approach inside Europe that we've seen work so beautifully in the other regions. So you have a QR code there on your screen. And I'm hoping we'll have a link in the chat as well for those of you who can't who can't actually get to the QR code itself, there are a few questions just to help us on the selection committee, the independent selection committee, to choose the only 20, unfortunately, fellows for Europe. And thank you so much for joining us today, to all of you, the participants, to all of the panelists of both roundtables who shared such amazing insights and wisdom. And thank you, as always, to the amazing NORRAG team behind the scenes, without whom none of this would be possible. And thank you very much to everyone who puts their time, energy, and effort into defending academic freedom all around the world. Thank you so much. Goodbye.